This tutorial is for 4th grade, Module 5, Lesson 23. In this lesson, we're going to use repeated addition and multiplication to show how whole numbers can be decomposed into fractions. In the first section, I'm asked to count by or skip count by a certain fraction. In part A, we're going to skip count by 1/3, and we will end when we get to 6/3. The counting has already been started for me. I have 0/3, 1/3, and I'll keep that pattern going until I get to 6/3. 2/3, and there I have 6/3, and I'm stopping at that point. And now I need to go through and circle the fractions that are equivalent to a whole number. Since I'm working with thirds, I know that it takes 3/3 to equal 1 whole. You can see that 0/3 has been circled because 0/3 is equal to the whole number 0. I'll move on to 3/3 because 3/3 is equal to the number 1. I have 3 out of the 3 pieces it takes to make 1 whole. If I continue, I'll move on to 6/3. If I have 6/3, I can think of that as 3/3 plus 3/3, which is the same as 2 wholes. So when I skip count by thirds, 0/3, 3/3, and 6/3 are those fractions that are equivalent to whole numbers. In part B, I'm going to do the same thing, but this time I'm going to count by 1/2. I'll start with 0/2, 1/2, and continue until I reach 8/2. Now that I've reached 8/2, I'll stop here. I'll go back and circle the fractions that are equivalent to whole numbers. I'll start by circling 0/2, since that's equivalent to 0. Now, if I think about my halves, it takes 2 halves to make a whole. So I'll circle 2 halves, that equals 1 whole. Then I need 2 more halves to make another whole. That would be 4 halves. That would give me 2 wholes. And then 2 more wholes would give me 6 halves, or 3 wholes. And then finally I would circle 8 halves. If I have 8 halves, I can make 4 wholes. Part 2 says use parentheses to show how to make ones in the following number sentence. I have groups of 1/4 that I'm adding together. In all, we're going to show how all of these 1/4 add up to 3 wholes. Since I'm working with fourths, it takes 4/4 to make a whole. I'll put a parentheses around 4 of the 1/4. That makes 1 whole. Then I'll put another set of parentheses around 4 more 1/4. That makes another whole. And a set of parentheses around the last group of 1/4, and that makes another whole. Altogether, I have 12/4, and with those 12/4, I can make 3 wholes. In the next section, we're going to show the same thing, but instead of repeated addition, we'll represent it through multiplication. Part A says to multiply 6 times 1/3. The 6 is telling me that I need 6 copies of 1/3, and we're going to show how that equals 2 wholes. You can see this first problem has been done for us. We started at 0. When I hop from 0 to 1 whole, that means I've used 3 of the thirds. So I need 6 copies of the thirds altogether. That means I need to make another hop of 3/3. That gives me 6/3 altogether. 6 times 1/3 is 6/3, and I've landed on 2. This proves how 6 times 1/3 gives me 2 for a final answer. On part B, I'm going to show 6 times 1/2. This means I need 6 groups of 1/2. Well, it takes 2 halves to make a whole, so when I jump from 0 to 1 whole, I've used up 2 halves. I have to keep going until I've used 6 halves. When I jump from 1 whole to 2 wholes, I've used a total of 4 halves. And I can make one more jump from 2 wholes to 3 wholes, and now I've used a total of 6 halves. 6 times 1/2 is 6 halves, and that shows how 6 halves equals 3 wholes. So 6 times 1/2 is 3. Sometimes when we do the multiplication, we don't land exactly on a whole number. If we look at this first example, the problem is 7 times 1/3, which means 7 copies of 1/3. We started at the 0 and jumped to the 1 whole. We used up 3/3. And then from the 1 whole to the 2 whole, we used up 3 more thirds for a total of 6/3. Well, I need 7/3. That means I just have to do one more hop of 1/3 to show that total of 7/3. Now we have to figure out the point where we landed. We went past the 2 wholes by 1 hop. Each section is broken into thirds, so our landing point is 2 wholes and 1/3. This shows how 7 times 1/3 equals 2 1/3. In the next question, we'll do 7 copies of 1/2. That's the same thing as 7 times 1/2, which means I need 7 copies of 1/2. When I start at the 0 and jump to 1 whole, I've used 2 halves. When I jump from 1 whole to 2 wholes, I've used 4 halves. When I jump from 2 wholes to 3 wholes, I've used 6 halves. Well, I need to use 7 copies in all. That means I need to make one more jump of 1/2. That gets me to 7 halves. Now to plot that point, I'm past the 3 wholes by 1/2. So that point is 3 1/2. That tells us that 7 times 1/2 is equal to 3 1/2. So we can see how we can decompose these whole numbers and mixed numbers by thinking about multiplication of these unit fractions.